Hi, John Dixon here from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're talking with Professor John Lennox about the problem of evil and suffering. John, Richard Dawkins says that we observe in our world exactly the sorts of things you would expect if there's no rhyme and reason, no God, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Isn't he right in a sense?
That's the way it looks to him. And raising that question raises a very difficult question for people going through the traumas of suffering, having been on the wrong end of evil and so on. And I find it a very hard question as a Christian, because it's the main reason, I would say, why many of my good friends don't believe in God. So I feel the force of the argument. I think if we've never felt the force of that argument, we're not really human. On the other hand, it seems to me there are two levels to it. There's an intellectual side and there's an emotional side. It's one thing to sit in a studio like this and look at the problem dispassionately. It's another thing to be on the receiving end and to actually be involved in the suffering or the evil or the pain. Or
Can we split those two questions?
Yeah, I think we have to split them.
And start with the intellectual one, because it's often presented as a proof against God's existence.
That's right. And sometimes I react to it and say, okay, there isn't a God. So you've solved the problem now. You've got an intellectual solution. And that's the way life is. And the wonder is perhaps that so many people have a half reasonable life. But that's just the way it is, blind, pitiless indifference. So you get rid of the intellectual problem, but I notice what you don't get rid of, and that's the suffering. Sure. But you do get rid of all hope. Now, it could be that that's how it is, and we have to face it. As Richard Dawkins said to me, that, we got to face it. Well, we do have to face it. So the question for me comes to this: are there any grounds for believing, facing this head on, that there is a God? And what I'd want to say about that, I want to say a number of things about that. But the first is this: that because I'm a Christian, I have the problem, the intellectual problem. But because I'm a Christian, I believe that Jesus Christ rose as a matter of history the third day, and that death is therefore not the end. And because death is not the end, I do believe that God is going to be utterly fair, so that people who have had the wrong end of injustice will be ultimately compensated for that. And atheists have no such hope. So what atheism does is it appears to give you an intellectual solution to the problem, but it removes all hope. It removes all hope of justice, which contradicts the very way in which we humans feel. We sense that there must be justice out there somewhere. Now, that doesn't prove there is, but it might make us disposed to have a look at the evidence that there is justice. Now, I will now have to move over to the other side of this question, because both sides now belong together. And it's this. You see, the heart of Christianity, for me, is not simply the resurrection, it's what preceded it. And we know that Jesus died, he was crucified. Now, that would be of very little significance. There were many crucifixions around the time, as Josephus, for example, records. But the significance of this particular one is the nature of the person who was crucified. The claim is that this is God incarnate. Now, a lot of people will find it very difficult to follow this, but it's good to see what the logic is. So try to come along with me. If this is God incarnate, the question is, what is God doing on a cross, to put it crudely and pointedly? And what I would say about that is this: that at the very least, it shows me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has actually become part of it. Now that, to my mind, is a window into a possibility that brings real hope, and historically has brought hope to millions of people that have had to cope with the most awful of sufferings, but somehow have had the strength to see that in the death of Christ, there's a window into the heart of God, that this is what God is like. So the question is really this: we find the universe to be ragged. There are some good things. There are some very bad things. Is there enough evidence amidst all of this raggedness to trust God for the ragged bits? And I would want to argue that the cross of Christ is not a simplistic solution to this. There will be the ragged ends, and I feel them, but is the beginnings of it.
But what does it really have to say to the mother who loses a child, for instance?
Well, for example, perhaps I put it in a slightly wider context than that. I nearly died last Christmas because of problems with my heart, and the medics got to me in time. And people would say to me, well, that's marvellous, you know, God rescued you. But I'm aware that in the very same year, last year, my own sister lost a 22-year-old daughter, a beautiful girl, full of life, very gifted, to a brain tumour that carried her away. Now, it seems to me that if Christianity is to be at all credible, it's got to not simply say to me, well, that's marvellous, God rescued you and you've got a bit more life. It's got to be able to say something to her, and I know it has said something to her because she's my sister. We've discussed this. And there's plenty of weeping and grief because grief is very real. But evidence of God's love that she will see that daughter again, that that daughter is not ultimately lost, that the parting, though very painful, is only temporary. Now, atheism hasn't got that to offer. So the basic question is this hope that Christianity offers true? And that will bring us straight back to the resurrection of Jesus. If that didn't happen, we can forget about it. If it did, we can grasp onto it with all our heart and our mind.